So, hello, this is a presentation organised by Morgan Gagnon and Star Kuzviwanza at the Provincial Employment Roundtable. So, Star Kuzviwanza is the inaugural Director of Policy and Research at the Provincial Employment Roundtable, where she plays a pivotal role in establishing PERT as the leader in policy solutions on the employment issues facing Quebec's English speakers. Star previously worked as a policy consultant in both private and public sector. She holds the Master of Public Policy from McGill University. Morgan Gagnon, Policy Research Leader PERT, is a skilled researcher and policy analyst with a background in Quebec higher education policy. She completed her master's degree at Concordia University, where she held a SSHRC scholarship for her research on institutional responsibility. Her work has been published in the Spring Journal of Ethics. And today we are joined by Morgan, who will be giving the presentation on the second shift, employment, gender, and minority language status in Quebec. So I am going to give the floor to Morgan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. A pleasure to be here. So thank you for the introduction. As Anna said, I'll be presenting today on kind of the employment situation of linguistic minority women, and particularly English-speaking women in Quebec. But I'll start a little bit. I'll start with just a little bit of information about my organization, and then we'll dive into the presentation proper. So I work at the Provincial Employment Roundtable, or PERT. So we're a nonprofit organization that looks at the employment of English speakers in Quebec and different issues and opportunities within that ecosystem to advance different solutions, to identify issues that might have been a little foggy in the first place. And how we go about that is founded on two pillars, a virtuous circle, our executive director likes to say. So first, we conduct research, and secondly, we engage with different stakeholders across a variety of different sectors. So education, employment service provision, and regional organizations active in different areas of Quebec as well. And we do this engagement not only to share our research once it's complete, but actually to inform the development of our research from jump, to ensure that it's actively engaging in a grassroots manner with the issues and opportunities identified by our different communities. So we're interested in, generally at PERT, I would say, we're interested in different issues that the English speakers in Quebec encounter in the context of employment. And we're also interested in looking at different, what we call communities within the community. So different maybe subgroups or subdemographics of English speakers, and seeing how different realities these different groups face intersect with their linguistic minority status. So today we're going to be talking about questions of gender identity as it intersects with language. So in particular, for this project, we were interested in looking broadly at the socioeconomic status of women in Quebec and understanding how that intersected with linguistic status, and to see what those effects, if there were effects on their on the socioeconomic status of English-speaking women in Quebec. So this is these are the questions that we set out to answer in our presentation, and we do that in this project primarily looking at statistics taken from the 2021 Census of Canada. We utilize this source because it's one of the only data sources that disaggregates data according to language. So we're able to see labor force and employment stats and income stats according to different variables that we can then splice by language, as it were. So that's really exciting, but there are a couple kind of major caveats or limits to this data. So primarily, the Census of Canada is only collected every 5 years, most recently in 2021, and it looks very heavily at the year 2020, which of course was a pandemic year. And in addition to that, so we're not getting kind of frequent data. And in addition to that, sometimes there are gaps in quantitative data, or we can see different outcomes, but we don't always have all the information for what could lead to that outcome. And sometimes when we're looking at really small groups, our data always isn't necessarily reliable. So I'll make those flags. But I think what's exciting about this data set is it sheds light on a couple key factors, and that like allows us to dig deeper into some of the things we'll identify. So final thing on the perhaps logistics front before we get into the data proper. There are a lot of different ways to define or to understand linguistic communities. So we utilize many different options. First language spoken, first official language spoken, that divides, in this case, Quebecers according to which of Canada's two official languages they're most comfortable speaking and expressing themselves in. This is a derived a variable or calculation that Statistics Canada does. Perfect. So I'll jump right into our statistics then. I'm going to start us off with a demographic portrait that just looks at the composition of Quebec and English-speaking women as a demographic group in Quebec in particular. So there are about 600,000, specifically 614,620 English-speaking women in Quebec, making up about 7.4% of the total population in the province. And you can kind of see the composition here of the population. So English-speaking men make up approximately the same share of the total population in Quebec, and then Francophone men and women make up a much larger portion of the pie at about 41–42% each. And then if we look specifically at the group of English-speaking women, so that group of about 600,000, we see that about a third are immigrant women. So about 200,000 English-speaking women identify as immigrants. Just over a third are visible minorities. About 25,000, about 4% are Indigenous women, and just over half of this group live in Montreal, which is consistent with the fact that Montreal counts a large proportion of the population in Quebec and of English-speaking Quebecers in particular. So next we'll talk a little bit about education. So the majority of English-speaking women, about 63% have a post-secondary diploma or degree of some sort, so kind of from CEGEP upwards. And the largest share of those, about 25% of a quarter of all women, English-speaking women with a post-secondary degree, have a degree in business and public administration in particular. So that's a rough overview of the group that we're talking about. So now I'll get a little bit more into the employment and income or the employment situation in particular. So first we'll look at labor force participation. So this is of the entire population age 15 over. What proportion of that population is in the labor force, which is to say are actively looking for work, so unemployed but actively looking for work, or actually have a job. So we see that 62.7% of English-speaking women are in the labor force out of the total population of English-speaking women, compared to 61% of French-speaking women. So they actually have the lowest labor force participation rate. And then on the other end of things, English-speaking men have the highest labor force participation rate, 70.4%. And then French-speaking men in the middle there was labor force participation rate of 67.1%. This graph shows that same statistic broken down according to the 17 regions of Quebec. With the additional stats for the province that I've just iterated just at the end there. So I won't delve into this graph in full, but what it helps us to see is kind of a trend in which English-speaking men consistently across the regions have one of the highest rates of labor force participation. So that as a group, they're most actively engaged perhaps in the labor force. And then we see lower labor force participation among English-speaking women as well as French-speaking women. And that kind of fluctuates based on region. So then I'll jump into unemployment. So if we're looking at the unemployment statistics, we see that English-speaking women have approximately the same unemployment rate, a little bit higher as English-speaking men, about 10.9%. Whereas French speakers in general have a lower unemployment rate, 6.7% for French-speaking women and 7% for Francophone men. So here we see in comparison to the last slide, where across the board, women tended to have lower labor force participation rates, and that varied a little bit based off language. Here we're kind of seeing the inverse, where English speakers tend to have, or the disparities that we're seeing fall according to language, with maybe a secondary variance based on gender. So once again, this is the same information kind of drawn out according to the 17 regions of Quebec, with the provincial information just in the last bar on the right for Quebec as a province. But again, it helps us to see trends across the province. So we see in most regions, English speakers have a higher unemployment rate as compared to French speakers. Often English-speaking women have the higher unemployment rate as compared to English-speaking men. However, in a couple key regions, so Côte-Nord, Gaspésie, and Madeleine, we see that English-speaking men in particular have a very high unemployment rate, almost or over one fifth of the labor force there. And then just as a brief comparison, so we observed between the 2016 and 2021 census an increase in the unemployment rate of English-speaking women by over 2 percentage points. I'll note again that the 2021 census examines a pandemic year, so that might have an impact on this figure. And unfortunately, you have to wait until the 2026 census to see what changes that highlights. So now here we'll look at the major industries in which English-speaking women work. So the primary industry, or the major industry in which English-speaking women are employed, would be health and social assistance, which has about 17% of all working women, followed by retail services, education, and then professional, scientific, and technical services. And here's kind of the same information compared to English-speaking men in the province. So we see a change in major industries. So English-speaking women are primarily engaged in health, in retail, in education, whereas among English-speaking men, it's professional, scientific, and technical services, manufacturing, retail, transport, and construction. I'll briefly note here that these different types of industries, we see women more heavily represented in industries associated with service and care, whereas men are more heavily represented in industries that might have more manual labor or more of a foundation in the trades, which might reflect historical or current kind of gendered labor or gendered areas of education as well. So this graph, it's really interesting to me anyway. It presents the main reasons for working, what do we have here? For not working full time. So this is a new statistic captured in the 2021 census. So it compares, in our graph, working at English-speaking men versus women. The census asked them, what were the main reasons that you had for not working a full-time job? And we see the largest share of respondees among both men and women responded other. But I'll just draw our attention to right here at the bottom, the kind of occupied with child care or family care, we see that English-speaking women are more likely to be not working full time because they're doing care related activities. And owing to just the second set of bars right here, owing to maternity or parental leave, we have about 7% of women not working full time for that reason compared to 1.9% of men. So this graph presents similar information, but instead looks at main reason for working primarily part-time. And here we see again, compared to English-speaking men and women, I'll just draw your attention to this middle bar here, where again we see kind of occupied with childcare or family care. Women are more likely to be working full-time for that reason. 7.9% of women who are working part-time were doing so primarily for this reason, compared to 1.6% of men. So we just see the way that perhaps caring professions or tendencies or traditions of care and for family, for children, is perhaps more heavily, or to some extent, more heavily engaged with by women. So next I'll switch to, we've just looked at different statistics for the labor force and for employment. So now I'll switch us to economic statistics. So this is median employment income at the provincial level. And we see, once again, a pretty large divide in earnings according to both gender and language. So within the province, French-speaking men have the highest median employment income at just over $41,000, and English-speaking women have the lowest at $28,400. This graph actually highlights disparities in income between English-speaking men and women. So it highlights for each of the 17 regions in Quebec, the gap in income. So in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, the second bar here, we see the highest disparity in income. So English-speaking men actually earn $25,800 more than English-speaking women. And we see that Nord du Québec is actually the only region where the disparity is negative, meaning English-speaking women may earn more than English-speaking men. We don't have the exact reason for this, but I'll note that some of the major industries in Nord du Québec involve education and public administration, which education certainly is heavily engaged with by women, as we saw by our main industry data, as often can be public administration. And I'll just note that the overall income disparity between English-speaking men and women in the province is over $7,000. So we see English-speaking men earning on average about $7,000 more than English-speaking women in median employment income. Finally, I believe finally, we have poverty rate data. So this looks at percent of individuals who are living in poverty in Quebec. English speakers in general have a much higher rate of or proportion of their population living within poverty as compared to French speakers. So 10% of English speakers compared to 5.8% of French speakers. We see again that this disparity falls primarily along linguistic lines. So 10.4% of English-speaking men compared to 9.5% of English-speaking women live in poverty in Quebec, compared to 5.9% of French-speaking men and 5.7% of French-speaking women. So taken together, and when we kind of hold all of these stats at once, we see that often English speakers and women have more precarious or worse employment and economic outcomes as compared to men and to French speakers. So we see lower rates of labor force participation among women. We see lower incomes among women. and among English speakers as compared to French speakers. We see higher rates of unemployment, but particularly high rates of unemployment among English speakers. And so when we hold all this together, we see that English-speaking women in the province are often less well-off or in a more precarious position than English-speaking men, as well as French-speaking women and French-speaking men. So we're observing a kind of double disparity or an intersectional disparity where both different elements of one's identity, in this case, gender, particularly being a woman, and linguistic minority status, being an English speaker, come together to impact the employment outcomes and the economic outcomes of English-speaking women in particular. I believe that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks so much, Morgan. That was wonderful.
Yeah.